back to another episode of Catholic Table Talk podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table. I'm your host, William Sabler, at the table again. Thank you for your continued support, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook or spreading it, Catholic Table Talk, by word of mouth. Also, if you have a show or speaker request that you would like to send in, please get a hold of me in a couple of different ways. You can message me in the comments below, or you can email Catholic Table Talk at the official Catholic Table Talk email, Catholic TT, that's 2 T's, at gmail.com. Now let's get on to today's show, where have you ever, or do you, I should say, do you know a guy named K Chesterton? If you're like me, maybe you have, but haven't really gotten much into detail with him. Or maybe you haven't, or maybe you love the guy. So, but today's guest will help us learn more about K Chesterton. His name is Mr. Chuck Chalberg, and he's performed Chesterton on EWTN's The Apostle of Common Sense. And he's a high school instructor and high school instructor on homeschool connections. I took a baseball class with them, really enjoyed it. So Mr. Chalberg, thanks for coming on the show and welcome to Catholic Table Talk.
Well, thanks, Billy, for having me. Yes, the last name of the Englishman whom we're going to talk about is Chesterton. Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who is long gone in one sense. He was born in 1874 and he died in 1936. He did not have a terribly long life, really, in the great scheme of things. He was quite large. He weighed perhaps 300 pounds. He didn't really take care of himself. The mark of a healthy man, he said, really ought to be carelessness rather than care. He made fun of people who simply exercised for the sake of exercise. You should do things. You should take long walks and talk to yourself, or wait to see what you're going to discover out there. The world doesn't lack for a want of wonders, plural. It lacks for a want, he liked to say, of wonder, a sense of wonder about the world out there. And yes, it is true that I have, for a number of years, traveled around, most all of it pre-COVID, performing as Chesterton for parishes and schools, primarily around the country.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think too, back when, when he was born, 1874, he didn't really live as long. Like you said, he was out of shape. But it was Gabriel Keith Chesterton?
Gilbert Keith.
So before we move on, just a quick question on that. When you said you traveled the country pre-COVID, is this something that you would maybe consider doing again if we get past COVID?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I hope so. It's actually been, there's an annual Chesterton conference that met live this past summer near Chicago. And I did a bit there as Chesterton, but that was the only time since, gee whiz, about a year ago. I was in San Francisco at a parish doing Chesterton. That was a little bit horrifying in a sense. You mentioned that you took a baseball course from me on homeschool connections, and one of the other characters whom I travel around doing is Branch Rickey, who signed Jackie Robinson and broke the color line in the modern era of Major League Baseball. And I have my wigs for the characters whom I do on little, plastic heads, styrofoam heads with grocery bags over the top of them. And I peeked under the bag and thought I had the right wig and put it in my suitcase. And away I went to San Francisco, and I got out to put the costume on and pulled out the styrofoam head and pulled the plastic grocery bag off, and it was the Branch Rickey wig. So I put the Chesterton suit on and the greatcoat on, and got the sword stick out, and got the mustache on, and Branch Rickey's wig, and kind of muffed it up. And Chesterton had a thick head of unruly hair, and I figured they probably wouldn't know the difference, and it was better than what's left of my head of hair. So the show must go on, and so it did.
That's a really cool story. Thanks for sharing. You gotta make it work, that's for sure. So, for Chesterton's books, he wrote a few books, and if you're like me, I like to read, but from getting from from beginning of the book to the end, doesn't really happen all the time. And like I said, I really have learned a whole lot about Mr. Chesterton. So, but there's one book that really stands out from his writings, and that is called Orthodoxy, which he wrote back in 1908. Could you just kind of talk about the book and what it contains?
Sure. It was his defense of traditional Christianity. He was himself not yet a Catholic at that point. He was raised well, we would today say a Unitarian, which was, next to nothing. They were called in England in the late 19th century Universalists, and the parents were that, and therefore, kind of barely Christian. And so he was raised in that atmosphere, and really, as a young adult, he went through some very dark times, near suicidal times, and nihilistic times, and kind of abandoning even universalism. But he came out of that, and in part it was realizing how empty all of that was, and in part he met of his wife, a woman who had a very modern name, at least as of the last, what would we say, 20 years. Her maiden name was Blogg, but with two G's, Blogg. I think it was the originally kind of a French name, but in any case, the English shortened it, and she was an Anglican, and and she was a serious Anglican, and Chesterton was quite taken by her practice of that religion, and he said he really had never met anybody who practiced a religion. He said it was like gardening, and that attracted him. And they were, in fact, married in the Anglican Church when he was 27. She was roughly about the same age. And again, this was well before. He did not become a Catholic until well after publishing Orthodoxy. He didn't convert until he was 48 years old in 1922. She had no interest in converting, and he didn't think, I think at the time he wrote Orthodoxy, he essentially was philosophically and theologically speaking a Catholic. but he didn't think it was a good idea for the two of them, even though they had no children and never would have children. They that it would be a good idea if they practiced a different faiths. But finally, after a trip to the Holy Land and stopping in Italy, he felt compelled to convert without her, and did so. And it really didn't take long for her after that to convert as well. But it is probably, Orthodoxy is probably his most famous book. It's never gone out of print. It was, however, not the first book of his that I read. I might say, you even knowing of him at your age, that outdoes me. I don't remember when I first became aware of him, and my parents were both college educated. They were both readers. My mother was Catholic, half Irish, despite my last name. My dad was Swedish American and a nominal Presbyterian who subsequently converted when I was maybe a young teenager. But in any case, they were readers, and I didn't really become aware of Chesterton when I was growing up. And even at college, I went to a Jesuit school in Colorado, Regis University, then Regis College, and majored in history, but had friends who majored in English, and remember no discussions of him. He really fell into, what would I say, forgetfulness for a number of years in the aftermath of his death, and we can talk about that a little bit more as we go on. There's clearly been a revival in the last 15, 20 years. But if you are a reader, and I was a reader, you see him quoted a lot. And I finally, I must have been, well into my 30s, when I thought I better read this fellow. And the first book I picked up to read was a book with the improbable title of "What's Wrong with the World?" And two quick things. He said whenever anyone asked him what was wrong with the world, his answer was really what everybody's answer should be: I am. We're all what's wrong with the world. We're all born with original sin, and he liked to say that original sin is really the only doctrine of Christianity that you can actually prove. And that line actually is in orthodoxy. In fact, I'm in a little discussion group that is rereading orthodoxy literally right now. And we had a session the other night, and I had forgotten that great line came from orthodoxy. We were reading the first few chapters of it. And I sometimes, when I go off and do the show, I'll get asked afterwards, now, where does this line come from? And more often than not, by this point in doing it, I've probably forgotten where the line was. And here I was rereading orthodoxy for the first time in, oh wow, probably 15 years maybe. And there it was. Original sin is perhaps the only doctrine of Christianity that you can actually prove. In any case, the other thing about what's wrong with the world that I was going to mention is that Chesterton's other response is to say, we don't ask what's right about it. That's what's wrong with the world. We don't ask what's right. And it's a book that he could have written today. It's an attack on feminism. It's an attack on the education system. It's an attack on big government. It's an attack on big business. And on that score, he's got a chapter, the dreadful duty of wow, does he have both names or just one? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Hudge and Gudge. I mean, he created these two names, and Hudge was the big government person, the socialist or near socialist or whatever, and Gudge was the big businessman. And they were, in his mind, and I think he's essentially right about this, they were both enemies of the common man, of the ordinary person. They were really in league with one another, he thought. And they were both, in their own way, operating against the family. One wanted people to be faithful to the government and let the government do things for them that the family should be doing. There's a great line in there that without the family, Chesterton wrote, we are helpless before the state. That's worth the price of admission alone, I think. Without the family, we're helpless before the state. And he didn't believe for a minute that the only solution was private enterprise, because again, bigness in private enterprise was a problem. And in fact, remember those dates, his coming of age was the late 19th century. And at that point, the bigger problem of the two was really big business. This was the age of the robber barons and et cetera, et cetera. He died in 1936, right in the middle of the heyday of the Soviet Union. And he was a critic of the Soviet Union, but he didn't really live long enough to see the purge trials and the gulag and all that really, in a sense, the 19th century was the age when people speculated on how to create heaven on earth. And then the 20th century became a time when people actually tried to do it. And it ended up with terror. It ended up with the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And I'm of the sort that thinks that they're really more similar. To be sure, one was interested in persecuting by virtue of, not virtue, but according to race, and the other according to class, but they were, I mean, what does Nazism? It's National Socialism. It's in many respects the same kettle of fish as Stalin's Russia. And one more point on that score: when the Soviets came to power in Russia, Chesterton said that this isn't good, but it isn't going to last. Why? He said it runs against human nature. People want to own things. They want to have a home of their own. They want to have a piece of land. The attempt to have all of this controlled by the state, there's going to be a rebellion against this at some point. He thought the real revolution that was going to be difficult to deal with was not the communist revolution. It was the sexual revolution. That unlike the communist revolution, was very consistent with our fallen human nature. And that one is going to be more difficult to root out. But the Bolshevik revolution was not necessarily going to be a piece of cake, but it was going to be less dangerous to the human soul I should add one more thing here, Billy. He called himself a distributist. He didn't call himself a capitalist. And he certainly didn't call himself a socialist. He and his friend Hilaire Belloc, another English writer, a cradle Catholic, Chesterton was a convert. Belloc was a little older, and Belloc was much more bellicose than Chesterton. He was much more well, Chesterton was a fighter in his own way, but he wasn't. Even his enemies liked him. Belloc's enemies didn't like him, but Chesterton clearly had enemies. H.G. Wells was an enemy, the classic English socialist, but they got along. George Bernard Shaw, another. Shaw, Chesterton said, embodied any number of things Chesterton could not abide. That he was a feminist, an imperialist, a socialist, a prohibitionist, and probably worse than all, he said he was a vegetarian. Chesterton, I might add, said at one point, he said, I have to plead guilty. I too am a vegetarian between meals.
Between meals.
Between meals, yeah. Otherwise, he wasn't. And certainly he wrote a poem. It's in a novel he wrote called The Flying Inn. That it's based on the idea that it was during the era when prohibition was kind of popular, but it didn't ban liquor. It banned the places where you could drink, and we're kind of doing the same thing with smoking. We haven't really banned smoking, but we've banned places where you can do it. And you had to have this particular flag to fly, that signified that you could sell and drink liquor, and hence the flying in. The flag would keep moving, and people would have to go find the flag and find where they could drink. And but he wrote a poem that I'm not going to be able to do it for you, called The Logical Vegetarian. You will find me drinking gin in the lowest sort of inn. You will find me drinking beer like a Bavarian, and on it goes. But oh dear, I'm not going to be able to do it off the top of my head. Maybe it'll come back to me as we go on. But Shaw loved him. I mean, I don't know that there was anything of importance that they agreed on, but they liked each other. And in fact, Shaw tried to talk Chesterton's wife, Frances, into divorcing him because he wasn't being responsible. He wasn't, and he was not interested in making money. He had again, I think there were physical problems that Frances had that prevented them from having children. He had a secretary that became like a daughter, Dorothy Collins, who, between the two of them, meaning Frances and Dorothy, they kind of kept him, I wouldn't want to say under control, but in line. And they would be the ones saying it's time to go out and give lectures. The coffers are getting low. You need to make some more money, or you need to write another Father Brown mystery story. They were the ones that were selling, as he didn't care about making money. And Shaw would talk to Frances saying, you really need to divorce him unless he takes better care of you. And of course she didn't and wasn't interested at all in doing that. But it was quite interesting that Shaw, the socialist, was, when it came to his own pocketbook, was very much a capitalist, and kept trying to convince Chesterton to do a better job of taking care of his wife. And
Yeah.
Anyway, you can jump in here and
Oh,
take us.
well, no, that is great stuff. So if you're out there listening and you haven't ordered the book before, Google it, get it for Christmas, because like Mr. Chalberg said, uh, Chesterton could have wrote it today with all the stuff we're having with the educational system in America right now. Um, big government is kind of taking over in America right now. All that stuff. So, Mr. Chalberg highly recommends the book. I go with them. So I highly recommend the book. That is Orthodoxy by K Chesterton. Get it for your loved ones for Christmas or for the birthdays.
There are the same thing could be said of the Father Brown stories that are, they're all short stories that he would dash off, and he was, I mean, he was a genius. There's no other way to say it. He would be writing an essay or a story, by hand at the same time that Dorothy Collins would be sitting there, and he would dictate something entirely different to her. And I can't begin to imagine how he could have done something like that. And he would go off on walks and settle in pubs and write, and he was notorious for laughing at his own jokes and not being able to suppress his own laughter. And he thought that was perfectly fine. He didn't want to be taken as simply a jokester. He thought you could be funny and serious at the same time. In fact, he once said, the opposite of funny is not serious. The opposite of funny is not funny. And so if you could make a serious point in a humorous way, he didn't think that at all detracted from the serious point. In fact, he thought it made it even more effective. But he could get, he didn't have much of a temper. He laughed more than the average by a long shot, but it did upset him that people dismissed him as nothing more than a jokester. And I think he was certainly much more than a jokester. And it's okay that he got upset by that, but I don't know that there was much else that ultimately upset him. He was not Belloc actually did run for office and was elected to Parliament as a liberal. But liberals in England in the pre-World War I period were kind of the small government party. John Stuart Mill and the idea of the importance of the individual. And Chesterton at times would go out, he would never think of running for office himself. Politics, he once said, should be left to the politicians. They're the only people dull enough not to get bored by it. So he did create in the mid-20s something he called the Distributist League. Now, it wasn't a political party. It wasn't running people for office, but it was to promote the very ideas that we've been talking about of limited government and limited size to the size of business. The difficult question there, of course, is how do you get there? If not by actually having a powerful government to break the businesses up. It's an issue. It's a tough problem. But he would go campaigning for Belloc, and there's a great story of his one day doing this. He and another fellow went off to some community, and they decided they would work each side of the street and that they would meet at the other at the other end of the block. I don't know, maybe it was a square of some sort, and they would work on opposite sides and then meet at the other end. And so Chesterton starts off this way to this house, and this other guy starts off this way. Well, a couple of hours later, this guy had worked his way all around the block down to the other side, and there was Chesterton with the very first house still arguing with the people at the first stop. I mean, and not necessarily arguing with anger, just debating.
Right.
He loved to debate.
Right. Oh, it's really, really cool stuff. Hopefully, you know, all going at home like I am, because this is really fun. Go ahead.
The one of the other books that, there are many of them, but right before Orthodoxy, he wrote a book called Heretics, and it was various chapters on various, well, including George Bernard Shaw, but another one on Rudyard Kipling. Chesterton was a little Englander, meaning he didn't like the British Empire. People would say England has an empire in which the sun never sets, and Chesterton would say, I don't like empires without sunsets. He simply was not a fan of the empire. And Rudyard Kipling, of course, was, and the white man's burden and all that goes with that. And Chesterton said Kipling didn't love England, he admired England. And he admired England because England was strong, not because England was England. You know, and Chesterton loved England because England was England. You know, whether it be the rain, whether it be English inns or English roads or English weather, and that's what he said. It was other places have climate, but we have weather. And one of his favorite dissipations was to go out in it and get wet.
Really, really great stuff. Yeah, like you said, he wasn't really a capitalist. He liked, like you say, he liked England because of England. He didn't like it because they were one of the most powerful empires or, you know, countries on the planet. It was because of that. It's just he liked England, you know. Just a nice, humble guy.
Well, he was humble because he was thankful, and that was really, I think, part of the key to his conversion to Christianity, that being thankful that this world exists. And I think that's, you know, he liked to say, even in his darkest days, he held on to belief by one thin thread of thanks. That he knew he didn't create this universe, and he knew in his heart somehow that somebody did. That this didn't just come out of nothing, or come by way of an accident. So even in those days when he was a late teenager, he went to an art school in the 1890s. He never went to university, and he would have been a wonderful oh dear, what do we call them? The political cartoonists. He really was a skilled artist, and but the experience at the Slade School in the 1890s, this was the 1890s gets called the gay 90s, and he didn't find it that at all. He found it at the art school that the really reigning philosophy there was a philosopher there was Nietzsche and nihilism and the emptiness and nothingness, and that ultimately led him to abandon the school and set out on his own as a writer on his own his own journey ultimately to the faith.
I really truly liked his story, going to Catholicism, and I also liked what you touched on, not long after his wife converted too. I think that's truly incredible. That's I think that just shows uh, how great the Catholic faith is. One is conforming. She thinks, yeah, maybe not, but then she follows suit after him. So that's really, that's, I'm blown away by that. That's really that cool.
Mhm.
So we talked about books and quotes and poems and all this other stuff. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about, Chesterton? You know, I already touched on it a lot. Is there anything else as we're closing out the show today?
Well, it might be interesting for your listeners to know that he did come to the United States. He came twice. He came in 1931, and again he came in. I'm sorry, I misspoke. 1921 for the first time, and then he came again in 1930. And in 21, he came on a lecture tour, and he was all over the country, mainly in the Northeast, but really into the South a little bit. And he came to Minnesota. He gave a talk in the Twin Cities. At one point in New York, he found himself in an elevator with Jack Dempsey, the boxer. And the interesting thing about that exchange, I have been told, is that Dempsey knew who he was. And that really says volumes, I think, about both of them,
Right.
that he was well enough known that this American boxer would have known who he was. And that this boxer, it's hard to imagine a boxer today, but who knows? But Dempsey knew who he was. When he came in 1921, it was at the height of Prohibition, and that did not sit well with him. This was Puritanism run amok as far as he was concerned, and he vowed he would not come again until Prohibition was over with. But he did come again. He came in 1930, mainly that time to lecture at Notre Dame. He spent the fall of 1930 teaching a course. He taught a course on Victorian literature at Notre Dame. I think he also traveled a bit then, but he stayed with a family in South Bend, Indiana, and they routinely served beer and wine, homemade beer and wine, in their own home, and it made Chesterton a temporary convert to Prohibition. He says, if you think about it, he said maybe your Congress was really onto something, that maybe they should pass laws banning the manufacture and sale of scarves and woolens and mittens and jellies and jams, and then mothers would start making them in their own homes again. And that was what the family was doing, that they were making their own spirits in their own homes. So maybe there was something to this whole prohibition argument. When he came in 21, I'd also add that he had to fill out a form, and it had a number of questions on it. Was he an anarchist? This was, again, not immediately after the anarchists who shot William McKinley. It was, it was 20 years, but still in easily the living memory of people in the government. Literally, that was on the form. Was he an anarchist? Well, of course, who would be fool enough to admit that they were when that was going to be necessary to have them come in? But it was also on the form, was he a polygamist? And on that one, he thought he should write not so stupid, or maybe not so lucky. to claim that he was a polygamist, or that maybe all of the 35 women with him were his secretaries, but he left it blank. And then there was a question on the form. Literally, this is true. On the form, did he favor overthrowing the government of the United States by force of arms? And he again thought he was going to leave that blank, but instead he claims, who knows if it's true or not, that he wrote the following, that he didn't know, but he would prefer to answer such a question at the end of his journey rather than at the beginning, which would be a perfect answer.
Right.
And in fact, you were asking about books. I mean, there's so many books. After his 21 trip, the first trip, he wrote a book called What I Saw in America. He wrote a kind of a travel account, and there were many things that he liked about this country. And I think the most important thing for your listeners to know is that he said the United States was the only country with a soul of a church, because it was founded on the basis of a creed, the Declaration of Independence. And that was the founding document of the country. And that anybody who subscribed to that creed could be an American. Your color, your nationality, none of that ultimately mattered if you do subscribe to the creed. And on that score, his great American hero, as you might imagine, was Lincoln, more than Jefferson, really. And he part of him did like William Jennings Bryan. He was a spokesman for the common man, and part of him, there was I have to play historian here for just a second. When Grover Cleveland was running for president in 1884, a Protestant minister accused the Democratic Party of being the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. It was the party of booze, the party of the Catholic Church, the party of the secessionist South, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. And Chesterton was asked about that, and he said, well, as far as I'm concerned, those are three things that I pretty much approve of: rum, Romanism, and rebellion. They're all good things as far as he was concerned. He was certainly not a pacifist. He cut his political teeth opposing the Boer War, because it was an imperial war that England was fighting in South Africa against the Dutch Boers. But he was never a pacifist, and he very much was a supporter of the war against the Kaiser, the First World War, and very thankful that the United States ultimately came into the war. There's a great Churchill line that may well have been attributed, or could be attributed, to Chesterton, well, that America does a lot of wrong things, but they eventually do the right thing. Now, that was probably more true of World War II than of World War I, but Chesterton probably would have said it in reference to World War I as well. Its history is much murkier than World War II, but again, he wrote another book after the First World War called The End of the Armistice. I think it was really a book, in effect, saying that this First World War didn't settle the problem of Germany, of a powerful Germany, plopped down in the middle of Europe. He did travel through Europe. he traveled as far as Poland. He traveled to the Holy Land. So he was a little Englander, but and very much loved England. But he travel, he liked to say, was an entirely worthless enterprise unless it succeeded in narrowing the mind. Because what it does is teach you how grotesquely different foreigners are and how marvelous home is. That was he dealt in paradox a lot. And because what do we usually say? Travel broadens the mind. And he said, travel is good because it narrows the mind. And most Chesterton paradoxes get at a truth. Or one of my favorites is, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And he didn't mean, he said, if you're going to mount an expedition to the North Pole, yeah, you'd want it done well. But if you find something really worth doing, well, it's worth, it's worth doing. He wrote that, first of all, in an essay on, and I think I should add, Chesterton was primarily an essayist. That was what he was best at. Many of his books really are collections of essays. He wrote an essay on Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And he discovered that Stevenson liked to paint, not walls, but liked to pretend to be an artist. But the heck of it was, he really wasn't very good at it, but he loved doing it. And he said, if he loves doing it, it's worth doing. Being an amateur is a good thing. In fact, when it came to sports, he thought being a pro, you'd lose the fun of the game. You'd lose a lot by making it your whole life. I might add, he after he published the essay on Robert Louis Stevenson, he got a letter from an angry reader. A fellow wrote him and said, my wife read the article about Robert Louis Stevenson, and she deliberately burned the toast and dropped it in front of me and said, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. K Chesterton, here's your toast. And the guy said, look what you've done. You made my life miserable. What should I do? And Chesterton wrote back to him and said, well, you could shoot her.
Oh, man.
He wasn't serious. He just said, tell her that I meant that in reference to oneself. What you find worth doing, of course, is worth doing even if you're not very good at it. Anyway, that.
Right.
I should mention the most, I don't know if I want to say the most important book, but at least as important as orthodoxy is his book, The Everlasting Man, which he wrote not long after he converted to Catholicism. So it would have been in the middle of the 1920s. And it's half the book is on man. And he was, how do I say that? I mean, he was not a Darwinian. He thought that was, entirely secular and entirely material, and there was no room for God in Darwinianism itself. But he wrote an essay at one point called "The Unimportance of Evolution." And he said the evolutionists are always asking the Pope to pronounce on evolution. He said the Pope's not going to do that. It's like asking him to tell you what kind of dressing to put on your salad. If God wanted to, have man come out of having been an ape, that but the important thing is there is this entity called a man, and that man is different from the apes. And he said it's really, it's not that important as to how all this happened, but there are differences clearly between men and apes, and Chesterton was certainly going to defend that, and did. The other half of the book, of course, is on Christ, and a defense of the Christian understanding of history. And it is important to know that he writes that book after he is converted to Catholicism. The same holds for, he wrote biographies of St. Francis and St. Thomas Aquinas after he converts as well. And again, who knows how many other books he would have written had he lived longer. He wrote a formal autobiography near the end of his life. He called, if we can go back to orthodoxy for a second, he called orthodoxy a slovenly autobiography. An attempt at an autobiography. I don't know that there's much truth to that. The early parts of it, he's talking about how he went searching for orthodoxy and discovered it, but discovered what people had long since discovered. He talks at the start of the book about a guy traveling in a sailboat and ultimately discovering England, not some South Sea island. But he said, I kind of did the same thing by intellectually speaking. And he wrote a novel called Man Alive about the main figure who, travels about but finds home. And that home is where one is most alive, and that place is the most important. It's the most important place. And he liked to say, we travel the world only to, I travel the world only to be able to, I'm trying to find my way home. I'm trying to find my way back. And in orthodoxy, he talks about at once being at home in the world and being startled by the world. And that to achieve both of those things is the key to a good life, to be at once comfortable in your home, but never so comfortable that you're not full of wonder about it and startled by it at the same time.
Really good quotes right there. So yeah, plenty of books to go choose from for Christmas. Look up Chesterton's quotes online. And Mr. Chalberg, you have a class, I should say, Homeschool Connection about Chesterton. Am I correct?
I have taught a couple of different classes. I did a class, and I do the classes as Chesterton. So I put the costume on, and at least the top half of the costume, and the wig on, and the mustache on. And I did a course on what's wrong with the world that way, and then I did a book using one of the biographies of Chesterton. And then a friend of mine, Dale Ahlquist, who heads the American Chesterton Society, has done a few books on Chesterton, and one of them is called Common Sense 101. And I did a book as Chesterton based on Dale Ahlquist's book, which the students read. I was going to do one this coming spring on heretics, the book that I mentioned a little bit ago, and it didn't attract enough students, so I don't think that one is going to happen. You can find a few of me as Chesterton on YouTube. If you just Google my name, you can find a few. And if I can do a shameless plug, I've got some DVDs as Chesterton. That I'll let you, Billy, provide all the particulars for that. But I do have those available.
Sounds very good. Well, that concludes today's show. So very good stuff about Chesterton, Mr. Chalberg. That's has been a lot of fun. I will I'll post the link to the YouTube stuff in the descriptions box below, so everyone can click on that. I'll click on the link so everyone can find Mr. Chalberg classes on Homeschool Connections. If you have kids that are looking to learn more about Chesterton or history, or like I said, I took a baseball class with Mr. Chalberg. Really had fun with that. So I'll provide those links down in the description. But Mr. Chalberg, it's been fun. Thank you so much for taking the time today to come on the show.
Well, you're entirely welcome. I mainly doing American history. That's what I'm kind of a fake Englishman, but I mainly do an American history course for Homeschool Connections as well. That's kind of I'm a retired academic who is moonlighting with, and in fact, it's Chesterton. I was at a Chesterton conference, oh dear, 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe even a little more than that, and met somebody who's involved with Homeschool Connections, and she talked me into getting involved with this, and it's been a lot of fun. So
okay, that's how you came apart of it. It was from the conference.
Okay,
that's really cool. So well, thank you for teaching Mr. Chalberg, because I really have had a good time in baseball. That was really fun, and I wish I could have done about Chesterton. It just never happened. I wish I could have.
there might always be another time. So
It could be. You never
okay,
know.
okay.
All right. Well, that's Mr. Chalberg, everyone. Like I say, I'll give all the descriptions down below in the description box. But God bless. God willing, we'll see you next week on Catholic Table Talk podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table.